The Pacific skies of 1943 carried two shadows that could not be more different. One was slender, agile, and feared since the first months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese A6M Zero. The other was heavy, powerful, and new, a bent-wing fighter whose howl earned it the nickname Whistling Death, the American F4U Corsair. When these machines finally met in combat, their clash became more than a duel of aircraft. It was a struggle between two philosophies of war: speed and firepower against lightness and maneuver. In the early months of the Pacific War, American pilots dreaded the sight of a Zero diving out of the sun. By mid-1943, however, the Corsair arrived to challenge that dominance. Its massive radial engine promised unmatched velocity. Its guns could tear through thin metal skins, yet its bulk and handling raised doubts even among its own navy. The Zero, on the other hand, still carried the aura of invincibility that had humbled the skies of Asia and the Pacific. So when Corsairs first rose into the tropical air over the Solomon Islands, pilots on both sides knew that something had changed. The Hunter now faced a rival built to withstand its claws. The question hung over every dogfight. Could the old master of the Pacific outfly America's new machine, or would brute power finally break agility's reign? In the months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific became a hunting ground for the Japanese Zero. Its full designation, Mitsubishi A6M, was hardly spoken by Allied airmen. To them, it was simply Zero, the fighter that seemed untouchable. With astonishing agility, long range, and pilots trained in ruthless discipline, the Zero outclassed every American aircraft that rose to meet it in 1942. Wildcats fell in swarms over Wake Island, the Philippines, and early Guadalcanal. For nearly a year, the Imperial Japanese Navy controlled the skies with confidence. Yet the balance of air power never stands still. Even as Zeros dominated, American engineers were already preparing a new answer. Chance Vaught's design, the F4U Corsair, carried the most powerful radial engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. Its sleek fuselage and bent gull wings were designed to house a giant propeller and reduce drag. On paper, it promised speed beyond 400 miles per hour, something no Japanese fighter could hope to match. But the Corsair's entry was not simple. Its first trials on carriers ended in disaster. Hard landings, poor visibility, and nervous naval commanders. For a time, the Corsair was restricted to land-based marine units rather than fleet carriers. Meanwhile, the Japanese were upgrading their Zero. The A6M III Model 32 appeared in 1942 with clipped wings and a stronger engine. It sacrificed some range, but improved roll rate and climb, answering early reports of heavier American fighters entering the field. Japanese planners believed this variant could extend the Zero's reign into 1943, giving their carriers and island garrisons the shield they desperately needed. The stage was thus set in the Solomon Islands campaign. Guadalcanal's jungles and Henderson Field became the focal point of a grinding war of attrition. American Marines on the ground depended on fragile air superiority, while Japanese forces fought desperately to keep supply lines open. By early 1943, Corsairs began flying from rough strips in the Solomons, their engines howling across the same skies patrolled by veteran Zero pilots. Every encounter carried more than tactical importance. It was a test of which design philosophy could define the rest of the war. To the Americans, victory meant proving that speed and firepower could defeat the finesse of the Zero. To the Japanese, survival meant clinging to the agility that had brought them glory at the war's start. In that crucible of the Pacific, the legend of the Corsair and the myth of the invincible Zero collided for the first time. To compare the Corsair and the Zero is to study two opposite schools of design, born from two nations with different resources and doctrines. On one side stood the F4U Corsair, introduced with brute force at its core. On the other stood the A6M Zero, shaped by Japan's need for reach and maneuver. Their clash was not only about aircraft, but about the ideas behind them. The Corsair's heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing more than 2,000 horsepower. It pushed the fighter to speeds over 446 miles per hour in level flight. That power demanded a massive propeller, over 13 feet in diameter, forcing designers to angle the wings downward and then back up. The distinctive gull wing, with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings and the ability to carry bombs or rockets, the Corsair was as much a strike aircraft as a fighter. Armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks gave its pilots a margin of survival unknown to early war flyers. The Zero followed a different logic. Japan's Mitsubishi engineers understood their nation's limits in engine output and production of heavy alloys. Instead, they pursued lightness and range. The A6M Model 32 weighed barely half as much as a Corsair and carried a Nakajima Sakai engine producing around 1,130 horsepower. Top speed was only about 331 miles per hour, but its agility in low-speed dogfights remained unmatched. The clipped wings of the Model 32 shortened range compared to the earlier A6M2, yet it could still reach targets farther than most American fighters. Armament included two 20mm Type 99 cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, weapons that could shred an opponent if brought into the Zero's tight turning circle. The trade-offs were clear. The Corsair could dive, climb, and absorb punishment. Its rugged design allowed pilots to escape battles with holes in their wings or cylinders missing from the engine. The Zero, by contrast, lacked armor protection and self-sealing tanks. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could ignite it. Survivability was sacrificed for agility and range, a risk acceptable in Japan's doctrine, which emphasized offensive spirit and decisive maneuver. These differences created a duel of tactics. The Corsair could not match the Zero's instantaneous turn rate, but it could dictate when to fight. With its higher speed, Corsair pilots learned to strike from above, fire a deadly burst, and climb away before the Zero could counter. Zero pilots sought to pull their enemies into twisting dogfights, where the Corsair's heavier frame became a disadvantage. What these numbers meant in the air was simple. The Corsair gave American pilots a margin of choice. They could engage or disengage. Zero pilots, once the hunters, now found themselves reacting. Technology had begun to shift the balance. By mid-1943, this contrast between the massive radial-powered Corsair and the lightweight Zero had become the central theme of Pacific air combat. Each encounter was a laboratory test, speed and firepower against maneuver and spirit. The results would shape the tactics of both air forces for the rest of the war. And while these specifications may seem like cold figures in the hands of young men flying over the Solomon Islands, they meant the difference between returning to base or vanishing into the sea. Numbers on a page never capture what it felt like to sit in these machines, strapped into a harness with the roar of the engine vibrating through the chest. For the pilots, the Corsair and the Zero were not just designs. They were companions, and sometimes executioners. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington of Marine Corps, who would later become one of the most recognized Corsair aces, described the first time he pushed the throttle forward. The nose lifted, the gull wings flexed, and the aircraft surged like a living beast. He called it a brute with claws, powerful and merciless, but in the right hands almost untouchable. Boyington recalled that against the Zero, the Corsair's speed was its salvation. If he dove first, he could not be caught. If he lingered, he risked being dragged into a deadly spiral that favored the Japanese fighter. On the other side of the war, Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces, wrote about the pride of flying the Zero. To him, the fighter felt like an extension of his body, so light and responsive that a gentle movement of the wrist could send it rolling and turning. But by 1943, even Sakai recognized the danger posed by newer American machines. He admitted that the Corsair's speed and ruggedness made it a formidable enemy. Hard to hit, harder still to bring down with the Zero's relatively light armament. American pilots spoke often about survival. Many knew that if their Corsair was struck, they might still limp back to Henderson Field with leaking fuel and shredded metal. Japanese pilots, however, accepted a harsher reality. The Zero could dance in the air, but once touched by heavy fire, it became a torch. For them, agility was both shield and gamble. Accounts from both sides tell of tense seconds in the sky. The Corsair pilot diving from altitude, guns blazing, the Zero twisting violently, seeking that one chance to slip behind its opponent. For some, it worked. There were Corsairs lost to the sudden snap roll of a Zero that pulled an impossible turn. But over time, the tide shifted. American pilots learned discipline. Never turn with a Zero, always climb back into the sun. Japanese veterans, though skilled, found themselves drained by the attrition, outnumbered, and flying machines that no longer guaranteed advantage. To the men in the cockpits, the war was not about statistics. It was about instinct, fear, and moments measured in heartbeats. The Corsair gave confidence through steel and horsepower. The Zero gave pride through grace and tradition. Between them lay the razor's edge of life and death, carved into memory by those who lived to tell their stories. The first true testing ground for the Corsair against the Zero came in the long, grinding campaign for Guadalcanal. In late 1942, American forces clung to Henderson Field, battered daily by Japanese bombers and fighters. Early on, the F4F Wildcat bore the brunt of the defense, often losing heavily to the Zero's unmatched agility. But as 1943 opened, the first Marine squadrons equipped with Corsairs entered the fray. The sound of their engines, deep, violent, and unfamiliar, announced that something new was coming to the skies. At Guadalcanal, Zero pilots still found opportunities to exploit their turning advantage. Many American pilots, still learning the Corsair's quirks, fell victim to sudden reversals in tight dogfights. Yet the Corsair's speed quickly proved decisive. In hit-and-run attacks, Marines could slash through bomber formations and escape before Japanese escorts closed the distance. These early duels showed that the Zero could no longer dominate at will. The campaign stretched north into the Solomon Islands. By mid-1943, the skies above New Georgia and Bougainville became constant arenas of combat. Here, Corsairs learned to fight as their designers intended, diving from altitude, striking hard, then climbing away. On November 11, 1943, during the Bougainville landings, Corsairs from Marine Air Group 14 intercepted waves of Japanese bombers, escorted by Zeros. Reports noted more than a dozen Japanese planes destroyed for only a few American losses. Pilots recalled the confidence the Corsair's armor gave them. Where once a single burst could spell doom, now they could absorb damage and keep flying. Perhaps the most symbolic clash occurred over Rabaul. This fortress base on New Britain was the heart of Japanese air power in the South Pacific. In October and November 1943, American forces launched massive strikes against it. Hundreds of Corsairs, joined by Hellcats and other aircraft, swept through intense opposition. Japanese records tell of Zeros scrambling desperately, meeting swarms of faster, more heavily armed opponents. Despite fierce resistance, the losses mounted. In a single day, over 50 Japanese planes were reported destroyed. Survivors described the frustration of watching Corsairs dive through their formations, seemingly impervious to return fire. For the Zero pilots, the psychological tide turned. Once, their aircraft had been the terror of the Pacific. Now, they faced enemies who could choose when and how to fight. American pilots, meanwhile, began to believe that the balance had shifted permanently. The Corsair, once doubted, had proven itself in the crucible of combat. These battles did not erase the Zero's strengths. Even in 1943, skilled Japanese aces claimed kills, and unwary Corsair pilots paid the price for underestimating their foe. But the trend was unmistakable. In attritional battles over Bougainville and Rabaul, the Zero's vulnerabilities, lack of armor, limited firepower, declining numbers of veteran pilots, were exposed. The Corsair became not just a match, but a predator. By the end of 1943, The Solomon skies no longer belonged to Japan. The Zero had met its equal, and in many respects, its superior. The Corsair's victories in these campaigns marked a turning point, showing that the era of Japanese dominance in the air was closing and a new chapter of Allied supremacy had begun. Every aircraft carries within its frame the tactics it demands. The Zero, light and agile, was designed for close-in combat. Japanese pilots sought to lure opponents into turning fights, confident that no American fighter could match the tight arcs and graceful rolls of their machine. Against Wildcats, this tactic had been devastating. By slipping behind and holding a target in the gun sight, Zero pilots wrote the first chapters of their legend. The Corsair forced a rewrite. Its speed and climb meant it could fight on its own terms. American instructors drilled a new mantra into their pilots: never turn with a Zero. Instead, Corsair squadrons used boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, unleashing a burst, then climbing back to safety. The Zero could not chase them vertically. Its engine simply lacked the power. Corsair pilots who respected these limits gained a decisive edge. Still, the battle was not automatic. In the chaos of combat, mistakes meant death. Pilots who lost patience and tried to circle with a Zero often paid in flames. Accounts from the Solomons show that discipline was as vital as horsepower. The Corsair gave Americans the tools, but training and restraint allowed them to wield those tools effectively. Strategically, the results were clear. In campaign after campaign through 1943, American losses declined even as Japanese losses mounted. At Bougainville, ratios of 3-to-1 in favor of Corsair squadrons became common. At Rabaul, mass formations of Corsairs swept aside defending Zeros, clearing the way for bombers to devastate the base. What had been a duel of equals in 1942 became, by 1943, a war of attrition that Japan could not win. The Zero had not lost its grace. In skilled hands, it remained dangerous, but the balance of technology had shifted. The Corsair's armor, firepower, and speed gave American pilots confidence to press the attack. Zero pilots, once hunters, now flew knowing a single mistake could mean annihilation. The psychological effect was profound. In the end, the tactical story of Corsair versus Zero mirrors the larger arc of the Pacific War. Early brilliance and daring could not withstand the relentless weight of American industry and adaptation. The Corsair symbolized this change. Flawed in its debut, doubted by its own Navy, yet refined into a weapon that stripped away the myth of Zero invincibility. So when the question is asked, who won between Corsair and Zero? The answer is found in the wreckage scattered across the Solomon Seas. The Corsair proved not just superior in combat, but decisive in tilting the air war toward Allied victory. When the smoke of the Solomon Islands cleared and the tide of war rolled northward, the Corsair remained in the skies while the Zero faded into memory. Yet both aircraft left behind legacies far greater than their specifications. They became symbols, one of technological might, the other of warrior spirit. For the Americans, the Corsair was more than a fighter. It embodied the ability of U.S. industry to adapt and overwhelm. From its troubled beginnings as a carrier reject, it grew into a machine feared by opponents across the Pacific. By war's end, Corsair pilots claimed over 2,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. Its rugged airframe allowed it to continue service into the Korean War, where it fought jet aircraft and proved its versatility as a ground attacker. To Marines who flew it, the Corsair was the steel guardian that brought them home from missions they once thought impossible. The Zero story was different, but no less profound. It began as the terror of the Pacific, dominating skies when Allied pilots had no answer. Its light frame and elegant design reflected Japan's faith in agility and daring. Even as newer American fighters eclipsed it, the Zero remained a symbol of the Imperial Japanese Navy's fighting spirit. Many young aviators flew it on desperate missions, some never expecting to return. For them, the Zero was both sword and coffin, a representation of sacrifice as much as skill. Together, These aircraft shaped doctrines that extended beyond the Pacific War. The Corsair reinforced the value of speed, protection, and heavy firepower in air combat, influencing generations of jet fighters that followed. The Zero, despite its eventual defeat, taught lessons about maneuverability, range, and the limits of sacrificing survivability for agility. Designers and strategists studied both, seeking balance between the extremes they represented. Even today, when veterans recall the battles above Guadalcanal, Bougainville, or Rabaul, they speak of the duels between bent-wing Corsairs and nimble Zeros as if they were gladiators in the sky. Museums preserve their shapes, films recreate their dogfights, and historians debate which was better. Yet the true measure lies not only in victory or defeat, but in what they symbolize. The Corsair stands for a nation's industrial resolve, the Zero for the resilience of warriors who fought against overwhelming odds. And so the final question lingers. In the clash between technology and spirit, which truly prevails? History leans toward the Corsair, whose power reshaped the air war. But in memory, the Zero still soars, a reminder that even in defeat, courage can leave a shadow as enduring as victory itself.